Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. South Korean President Lee Jae-myung has returned from his two-day visit to Canada, where he attended the G7 summit as a guest, marking not only his first overseas trip since taking office, but also his official debut on the global diplomatic stage. The visit, grounded in what he calls a national interest-based pragmatic diplomacy, included back-to-back summits with leaders from 9 countries and a brief meeting with the UN Secretary General. Most notably, Lee sat down with Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba for the first Korea-Japan summit under his leadership, just in time for the 60th anniversary of the normalization of ties between the two countries. However, the much-anticipated summit with U.S. President Donald Trump was postponed due to Trump's emergency return to Washington. All eyes are now on what comes next for Korea's summit diplomacy. To delve deeper into this, we connect to Hannah Kim, Associate Professor at Seogang University, GSIS. Welcome, Professor.
Thanks for having me again.
And also joining us is Daniel Connolly, Associate Professor of International Relations at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. A big welcome.
Thank you for inviting me.
So let's start a discussion with Professor Kim. Like I've said, President Lee Jae-myung's debut on the global stage, he's now returned from his first ever appearance at the G7, and the presidential office called it a restart of high-level diplomacy that had long been stalled. So from a pragmatic diplomacy standpoint, how do you assess the significance of his presence at the summit?
Yes, in many ways, President Lee Jae-myung's presence in the G7 summit, along with the bilateral meetings that took place, hold quite a big bit of significance because it really did signal to the international community that South Korea's summit diplomacy has been restored after a tumultuous 6 months. So the chain of events that followed President Yoon's martial law was highly unusual and it drew global attention. So inevitably, South Korea's summit diplomacy was put on hold during this time. So from this perspective, President Lee's attendance itself served as a critical turning point by demonstrating that South Korea had returned to the global diplomatic stage. And even National Security Advisor Ri Sung-rak commented that I think of just a few days ago on June 15th that his President Lee's appearance marked the first international stage to show that South Korea has overcome its democratic crisis and that democratic Korea is now back. But that being said, one disappointing aspect of all of this was the cancellation of the U.S. ROC summit. A bilateral meeting was originally scheduled for this morning, but President Trump abruptly returned to the U.S., citing the situation in the Middle East, which led to the meeting being called off. And even though the South Korean side did express understanding, to a certain extent, it can still be viewed as a diplomatic discourtesy. And so because of this, from South Korea's perspective, it did what it can to restart diplomacy, but there were some external events that prevented the full ability for a lot of different types of summits.
So there were a lot of ups and downs. Lee's presence at the G7 definitely seems to set the tone for how Korea intends to, re-engage globally. Now, one of the notable outcomes from the G7 was President Lee's meeting with Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba. Professor Connolly, it was the first Korea-Japan summit under the Lee administration, and remarkably one of the earliest such meetings by any incoming Korean president. How do you view the significance of this bilateral encounter?
Oh, I definitely think it was a very kind of crucial test of President Lee's summit diplomacy, because to some extent, the Yoon administration had really built up a very strong trilateral cooperation with Japan, and this was strongly supported by the United States. So he kind of stepped into this situation where it's impossible to stop this trilateral cooperation. He has to keep momentum without sacrificing Korean interests. And I think the meeting they had today, or at the G7, was a very good example of how Lee managed to use the right kind of language, talking about future-oriented partnerships, really demonstrated that South Korea is a reliable partner to Japan and, by extension, the United States. I think this is reflecting an attempt to make a two-track approach where the historical issues are put on one side, and maybe a more future-oriented, focusing on business and commercial challenges in the region. But I do think, though, there's still a problem in the future that trilateral cooperation, there's a fundamental divide between the United States and Japan, who envision it much more of a regional approach, especially against China, maybe even against Russia, whereas the ROK is much more focused on keeping it oriented towards North Korea. So I think moving forward, President Lee has to deal with this deviation of interests between the three sides of trilateral cooperation.
Right, so further discussions would be necessary while keeping the momentum under the new administration. Now, adding to that, the presidential office emphasized that this meeting may help create a pathway for resolving historical disputes a little bit more smoothly. Professor Kim, from here on forward, what kind of approach do you think should the Lee administration take in steering Korea-Japan relations?
I think Professor Connolly mentioned, the importance of this because, in many ways, President Lee Jae-myung is going to be trying to, or he has been envisioning this so-called two-track approach where he's trying to treat historical issues and present-day cooperation separately. And I also think this aligns well with President Lee's pragmatic leadership style, which emphasizes practical solutions over ideological rigidity. But as Professor Connolly mentioned, it's not really clear how long this is going to actually last. From previous more progressive administrations, we saw that there were diplomatic frictions between, the Democratic administration in South Korea, along with the Prime Minister in Japan, and this was very visible during the Moon Jae-in administration as well. So in many ways, I think President Lee has to navigate not trying to avoid these frictions, but also trying to pursue some of these things that did take place during the former president, President Yoon Suk-yeol's administration. For example, trying to potentially pursue trilateral cooperation again. It's very unlikely that something like Camp David Summit will take place, but he does have a very clear line that he needs to walk in order to avoid a lot of the mistakes that previous administrations have made.
So there seems to be a little bit of hope that this early diplomacy might ease some of the long-standing friction between the two countries, but that's depends on how it will be managed moving forward. Now let's switch our focus a little bit to Washington. A highly anticipated meeting between President Donald Trump didn't actually materialize. We had a lot of things to discuss. Some had hoped it could open the door to, new trade talks in Korea and the U.S. Realistically, Professor Connolly, when do you think we might be able to see that first summit between President Lee and President Trump?
Now I would say maybe the earliest window would be the NATO summit on June 24th and June 25th. The problem is, though, is President Lee hasn't made any concrete announcements that he plans to attend the summit. There have been some rumors, but I think that's the next possible window. And for example, the Australian Prime Minister, he's already trying to reschedule his one-on-one meeting with President Trump at the NATO summit. So I strongly expect perhaps there may be some discussions going on right now with the Lee administration of doing the same. Because the deadline for the tariffs is June 8th, so there's not a lot of time to cut a deal.
Right, definitely. Time is ticking. We'll have to make a decision really fast. Now, even though the delay in the summit is quite disappointing for many, some people argue that President Trump's focus on broader global priorities might ultimately benefit South Korea. Professor Connolly, what diplomatic impact do you see from this postponement?
Right. On one hand, it was a little bit of a blessing in disguise. Trump did not appear to be in a mood to make any compromises or concessions at this year's G7 meeting. Even with the host Canada, he kind of made a promise to establish a trade deal in the next 30 days, but he kept making comments like, I have a tariff concept or I'm a tariff person. So there seemed to be a very kind of strong reluctance to cut any deals. The same thing with the Japanese prime minister. He flew back without any tariff deal as well. So I think on one hand, this gives the Lee administration more time to prepare their negotiations. President Trump is also infamous for being very changeable, so maybe he may become more lenient as the deadline approaches. But I'm a little cautious to call a crisis in the Middle East as an opportunity for South Korea because a war in the Persian Gulf could have profound impacts on the region, right? 20 million barrels of oil go through the Persian Gulf. If that gets interrupted, I think all of East Asia, Japan, China, and Korea are going to have serious economic fallout. So I would say it's a two-edged sword missing the summit with Trump.
Thank you for explaining for us both sides of the situation. Now, turning to the broader strategic landscape, Professor Kim, over the past few years, the G7 has taken a consistent stance on curbing China's influence. And as President Lee continues to emphasize pragmatic diplomacy, how should South Korea position itself between competing interests of two big powers, U.S. and China?
It's very difficult for Korea to position itself, and I think Korea is always kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place when it comes to positioning itself between the United States and China. And even until recently, the G7 did not always take a hardline stance against China. For example, at the 2023 G7 summit, the member states issued a relatively friendly joint statement that sought to contain China while still leaving room for cooperation. At that summit, President Biden actually expressed optimism that there may be a thaw in US-China relations that would occur very shortly. And the United States sent a series of high-level officials to Beijing to manage the competition between the two countries within a controlled framework. And so rather than opting for decoupling, the G7 leaders adopted a de-risking strategy during that time, which was aimed to reduce their dependency on China while maintaining avenues for cooperation. But then in the 2024 G7 summit, we saw that there was a much tougher and more comprehensive statement on China. And there was a 36-page communique where China was mentioned 28 times. And the G7 started to strongly criticize Beijing for supporting Russia's war in Ukraine and for its various unfair trade practices. So this showed that the G7's position on China had shifted within a very short period of time. So now with President Trump back in office, many G7 countries are experiencing friction with the United States on a number of fronts. And under these conditions, it may be increasingly difficult for the G7 to present a unified front against China. So this could actually provide President Lee Jae-myung with more diplomatic flexibility and room to pursue a more pragmatic foreign policy, as he has been emphasizing, towards the US and China. And in such an environment, it might be possible for President Lee to even emphasize South Korea's role as a constructive bridge builder that engages with both sides, where national interests align while avoiding more rigid alignment with one side.
Now, as Professor Kim touched upon the G7 again, let's delve deeper into that. Even though Korea is not really a formal G7 member, President Lee attended this summit as an invited participant. And there he even proposed the idea of a potential G7 plus. Professor Connolly, do you believe that this visit effectively communicated Korea's readiness to engage and contribute to the G7's global agenda?
Oh, yes, definitely. And maybe building on what Professor Kim just said, I think the G7 is experiencing a little bit of a crisis right now. And this crisis creates an opportunity for South Korea, but the same opportunity can also be a challenge. So for example, Canada, the host nation this year for the G7, really emphasized that they wanted to engage with partners beyond the G7. They emphasized building coalitions with reliable partners who have common values. And South Korea really demonstrated this role well, I believe. They showed up, showed themselves to be a responsible actor with lots of economic, technology, defense kind of goods that they can provide to this organization. And this, I believe, is exactly what Canada and the Europeans were looking for, this kind of reliable middle power that can carry its own weight. But at the same time, this kind of lack of US leadership that's creating new roles for South Korea to show its place in the world is also means that the G7 is weaker than ever before. So there was not even an attempt to make a full joint declaration. Trump left early. He even insulted Macron when he left, repeatedly mentioned that Russia should actually be part of the G8 like it used to be. So I think South Korea is kind of invited to a party, but the party already has some serious problems. And the G7 has always had a legitimacy problem. It only represents 10% of the world's population. So I do think that this sort of G7 plus idea can be very important for South Korea to make the framework more inclusive and less of an exclusive club of rich, powerful states.
So this idea of a G7 plus certainly sent a message to member states as well. Now, President Lee Jae-myung spoke twice during the G7's expanded sessions, focusing first on energy security and critical mineral supply chains, and then on the link between AI and energy demand. Professor Kim, he outlined Korea's plans to lead in both areas, including through the Mineral Security Partnership and AI semiconductor development. Do you think these proposals will translate into real cooperation with other nations?
Yeah, I do think it's possible that these proposals could translate into real cooperation. They are relevant and they align well with the values and interests of the global community. As Professor Conley mentioned, this was mentioned during the G7 summit several times. But in order for this to actually turn into cooperation, it needs to be very clear whether South Korea is going to be viewed and acknowledged as a global leader through its technological strength. In many ways, South Korea can be viewed as at the forefront of advancements related to semiconductors and battery technology. So in this sense, South Korea may have an edge. The proposals are also timely and credible given Korea's technological base. Additionally, Korea is seen as a capable and non-threatening partner by most major players, which makes it an ideal collaborator in areas that require high trust and multilateral coordination. But at the same time, there are going to be many limitations that can't be overlooked. And from the international perspective, the US-China rivalry will continue to affect these discussions. And some countries may be hesitant to work with Korea if Korea appears to be closely tied or allied to one bloc. And from a domestic perspective, Korea needs to back its proposals with domestic investments, which may take time and effort. And as we've seen over the past 6 months, South Korea domestically still has a lot to handle at this time. And also, in addition to that, there are many countries that are trying to lead in AI and semiconductor development, including Japan, Germany, and the United States. So without a clear reason as to why South Korea should lead in these fields, these overlapping agendas are going to increase competition, and that's going to dilute the willingness for stronger cooperation among a lot of these countries. There are definitely there's potential, but there are also some limitations as well.
So we'll have to see how these ambitions would be realized in the future. Now, before we conclude our discussion tonight, Professor Kim, we talked about NATO a little bit a while ago. It will be held on June 24th and the June 25th, and President Lee is reportedly leaning towards attending. It's not fixed yet, though. If he does, what should we be paying attention to from the standpoint of pragmatic diplomacy?
I think Professor Connolly mentioned this earlier as well, but even in the G7 summit, President Lee Jae-myung participated in the G7 summit just 12 days after his inauguration. And he himself acknowledged during a press conference that attending a major international summit so soon after taking office is clearly a challenge, and he considered not attending because there are so many domestic issues that await his attention right now. But he chose to attend, and part of the reason why was to hold the meeting with President Trump, which didn't happen. But it was important because of the upcoming bilateral tariff negotiations. So right now, I think it's very crucial for President Lee to meet with President Trump ahead of that deadline. And so it's very likely that President Lee will seek to attend the upcoming NATO summit as an alternative venue for these talks. I think this is one of the more pressing international issues that he needs to face. So hopefully we can see meaningful discussions take place soon so that the US-Korea tariff agreement can be concluded in a mutually satisfactory way, because a diplomatic breakthrough on this issue would not only ease a lot of economic uncertainty that we're seeing in Korea right now, but also demonstrate the effectiveness of his pragmatic diplomacy on an international stage.
So President Lee's possible attendance could be another chance to elevate Korea's profile as well as hold discussions on the tariff issue that many have been waiting on, and we'll be sure to keep tabs on that. Thank you so much for your time and for your insights tonight, Professor Kim and Professor Connolly. We appreciate it so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.